Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tractable. I'm your host, Shitesh, CTO at Orb, and today I have with me David, who is the CTO at Sentry. Sentry is an error monitoring and performance monitoring tool that probably every developer on the internet has heard of, with customers like Sonos and GitHub and Reddit and some 90,000 more. So really excited to dive in with David. David, welcome to the podcast.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into the technical details of Sentry, I'd love to just hear a little bit about the origin story of Sentry in your words. Obviously, you've been working on Sentry for a while. How did it come to be? And give us the kind of playback of the last decade or so.
Yeah. So, Sentry is super old at this point. We started it I started it in, I think, 2008. Open source project, dashboard for errors is basically how you can think about it. And from there, I want to say it took on a little bit of a life of its own. I think useful things get adoption, and we saw some of that where people wanted what it meant built. And I'm the kind of persona that if there's adoption, I actually want to work on it. It's like a motivating factor for me. And so hacked on it on the side for a few years and then eventually started the business. We bootstrapped that, raised some money, hired a bunch of people, and have been continuing to kind of grow it out from there. But fundamentally, it's very similar to what it was when we started the project. It's still a dashboard of your errors. We have some other products now, of course. It's a really simplistic idea, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's very easy to describe the product, especially to a developer who has to deal with errors. Do you think there's anything about the positioning of the product or the meat of the product that has really changed in that time, or anything where you feel like, oh, I'm surprised that we started going into this territory, whereas before I was just thinking it would maybe be a simpler product or just be dashboard of errors?
Yeah, I think when we raised, very different industry when we raised our funding, which was 2015, and I didn't have a lot of conviction that errors, like error monitoring as a product category, was enough to build like $100 million recurring revenue business, which is how you need to think about venture, right? And so we're like, well, we have to build more with, it's going to be this and then something else, which is probably performance monitoring. And we basically just took the idea of like, we mess things up a lot in production. Let's just build more tools for us to help us resolve those issues, kind of in the same guise as what Sentry did, because the bread and butter of the core product experience was just, there's an error, it's in your inbox, all the details there. It kind of took away this like frustration of you didn't know what's going on, you didn't know how to debug it. And we're like, well, there's a lot more problems, so we could probably apply that same formula to. I think the surprising thing over the years was, one, the core product and what most people pay for is actually still, it's obviously different, but it's mostly the same thing at like a surface level, right? We expanded to like new audiences, so like new technology frameworks and things like that. But I think something like 80% of our revenue comes from error monitoring, which I would not have believed if you told me, in 2015 that was possible. So I guess that's cool. But yeah, nothing overly surprising. I think we're still figuring out product 2, 3, 4, 5 and really getting those is something that we're proud of. But otherwise, the core has done really well.
Yeah. So you've obviously had a large part in building the core of Sentry. One thing I was curious to dig into is it's easy to describe, but I imagine there are a lot of very tricky technical challenges, especially as you go from, adopting it from a few teams to tens of thousands of teams. So what do you think are the kind of trickiest technical challenges you've had to architect around or kind of push on over the years?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the bread and butter of Sentry, the goal is instrument every application whenever there's an error, sort of process that, make it human readable, do whatever needs to happen to make it so you can consume that really quickly, and then decide if you need to notify somebody or not, right? And the interesting aspect, there's two fundamental things that are hard about that problem. One, how do you do this in every technology? But it's not a hard problem. It's just a tedious problem for the most part. And so it's just like constant, write more code, write new language, deal with new framework over and over and over.
Yeah.
So it's not a fun problem, but it's an easy problem, right? The other problem, which I wouldn't say is a hard problem, but maybe you wouldn't expect it early on, is one of the biggest challenges of Sentry is dealing with massive spikes of inbound errors and things like that. And this actually gets worse as we add more products. And so for a long period of time, Sentry's fundamental goal was, how do you just handle like denial of service nonstop? Like somebody's going to have a big outage. They're going to send us all the errors. We can throw them away. That's great. Like the data loss is not a problem, but we need to stay online. And ideally, it only impacts that customer that say we're delaying their data or something like that. And so a good analogy, actually, if I assume Gmail still does this, but back in the day, actually with Sentry, we flooded our inboxes because we took down the site and we were sending ourselves And actually, this might not have been Sentry. This might have been something else. But we were flooding ourselves with error emails, basically. It was like an email per error or something. And what Gmail does is it basically delays all inbound at that point. It basically makes your email unusable. It's not fun. But no other customer gets affected. Like it doesn't delay your inbox because I flooded my inbox, right?
Right.
So Sentry has that same problem. And that took us a lot of time for how do we really optimize things so it really handles a lot of traffic pretty smoothly. How do we optimize things so especially when there's a repetitive concern, that's pretty tight to manage. And like I said, it's not as hard as it might sound. There's actually a lot of easy technologies to approach these problems with. But what it meant over time was like we just built up many layers of a firewall. So there's an IP level, like pure IP tables firewall level. That's like the cheapest version to remove data from the system, but also the least flexible and accurate and things like that. And then we just have a few more of those. And so it's just a lot of dealing with things like that, which let me tell you is not fun when it's your side project because you're just on call 24/7 and you're also getting paged all the time. For this kind of thing.
Well, one question I have about that is, how do you think about the different use cases of error monitoring? So, you could imagine some people are totally okay with losing a bunch of errors because they know there's a big outage and, they don't need to see all those errors in Sentry. Whereas some people, it's possible, want like a pretty precise count of how many occurrences of this error were there, even in the presence of a big spike. So is that like an architecture level trade-off versus, a customer by customer sort of give people as much configurability as they want so that they can, in some sense, get the experience they want out of the product?
Yeah. Turns out configurability is like one of the worst things that could exist. And so early days Sentry, what we do is like you have errors come in, we would fingerprint them, basically like hash the stack trace. And then if we had seen it a lot, we would just throw them in the trash can, right? So an analogy here is like maybe the first 100 errors, we captured all of them for the first 100 like instances of an error, right? And then the next 100, maybe we only captured 10 of them or something like that. And it amounted to something like if there were 1 million copies of the same error, we might only store 1,000, which is awesome, right? When you think about flexibility, there's some challenges with that because what you don't care about is the duplicate information in error, but you do care about all the unique information. So you care about things like which browser was it happening on? If there's like a large variance of browsers, you actually need that metric effectively. And so we had to build abstractions and kind of make that cheap. And then over the years, we found there were more and more versions of that. Well, I want to answer this kind of specific question about this error that would require me to have a lot more data than what's been sort of denormalized already. And so over time, we went from this sort of sampling algorithm to we're just going to store everything. We're kind of charging for that anyways, which is where configurability can't work. And it was kind of fine. And what I mean by that is like, if you imagine we're trying to like operate on margins or something, because Sentry doesn't do value-based pricing. We effectively do cost-based pricing. And so cost us $1 for something, we charge you $9. I don't know. I'm not sure the math on hand. That's the goal though, is something like significant from a margin point of view, because if people don't know how this works, you got to pay for engineers. And what you're paying for is the continued development, not just the maintainability of software, right? If I'm telling you it's $1 per error and you're like, well, I want you to store less of those, but I still want you to process all of them. I'm like, well, how much does that cost us? And all of a sudden you're in this complicated scenario where it's like, I don't want to deal with these problems, And so we just decided to make it all the same. And here we are storing lots and lots of data.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say you don't do value-based pricing. Instead, you kind of do cost-based pricing. I imagine it is very, very hard to build up the same level of product experience that Sentry has built, even if you could store all the errors, right? I mean, you all have an alerting product. Even just the ability to group and filter by dimension, like all those product capabilities, have taken years of R&D. So is that a conversation you have with folks who maybe you're on the phone with trying to get to adopt Sentry? Or is it just like pretty obvious because so much of the product has already been used by developers that people know like, yeah, there's no way I want to build this. And that category has just formed, especially over the last, I'm guessing, 5-7 years.
Yeah. I don't think we have as much of a problem these days about like, should I build my own?
Yeah.
There's a question on, do I need something like Sentry versus just logs? And that question's persisted forever. It's become less and less common because it's like, yeah, if you have a problem in production, it's like, does it matter to you? What matters to us, because we ship changes all the time. So we're breaking things all the time. So we need to be able to fix it. Right. And that's the status quo in tech. But not everybody operates that way. So they're like, yeah, if there's a problem, we'll just figure it out. Or we'll just go dig in the logs and it's fine if it's harder or something. That's fine for some people. Our sort of pitch has always been, and I actually still believe this to be the truth. Like I have a side project. I just run Sentry on it. I don't have Datadog or metrics or any of these random things. And honestly,
Yeah.
and I run on GCP often, and I'm like, if I have to go dig in GCP's logs, and I'm not saying GCP is good at this, to be fair, they're not. But if I had to go dig in logs or something, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, all of my problems are errors or something. They should show up in Sentry. I'm not at a scale where I should have other like contrived problems and I need something else. And that's a very big value prop, right? At the end of the day. And sort of Sentry's whole belief over a long period of time was we will be able to solve more and more needs of businesses. And so over time, we'll be able to actually grow sort of more alongside a business versus trying to play catch up to what their needs might be. And that works out pretty okay, I would say.
And that philosophy, I think, is actually very, very different. If you look at something like Datadog, they have a huge product suite. So, obviously Sentry has multiple products, but Datadog has 30 products or 40 products, right? Do you think that is just a reflection of them being dragged into different markets and, some business fundamental thing? Or do you think that is a different stance on where they think instrumentation should go and like some technical philosophy stance?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously can't really speak for them, but I think there's some mechanics that are kind of standard in businesses, right? There are different modes of operation, first off. Like some people choose, they want to build a thing, right? And then they'll figure out how to get adoption. Other people are like, tell me what you want, customer. I'm just going to build that and sell it to you.
Yeah.
That latter thing, I think, is what almost everybody does. And it's probably significantly easier as a business. We don't do that. We say, like, what do we think is interesting to build? We're going to build that. We're going to have a thesis behind like, yeah, there are customers that want it. It's valuable. And usually that starts with it's valuable to us. But that latter point, I think also becomes, as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's hard to just do like pure R&D, right? Like you are dealing with demands of the market at the end of the day. And Datadog is very, very, very big. And you look a lot at what they build, and it's not very exciting for the most part. Just like AWS or GCP or any of these big enterprises, they build a lot of really boring checkboxes. They're not innovative. They're not doing anything different than they ever did before. They're just like helping pick the most unexciting corporate logo you can think of. They're helping those companies consolidate on a mediocre product experience, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine. It is what it is. We try to avoid anything that looks like a checkbox. And I think the other thing is, at least in our market, there's this like confusing situation that's always existed where monitoring is infrastructure. It's like the IT team that's running the production infrastructure is in charge of monitoring everything. And if you look at every tool that's kind of existed outside of Sentry or sort of some of these newer ideas, they're always just like, here's my logs, here's my metrics, here's my dashboards. It's always the same damn thing over and over. And they're never actually connected to like what we do, which is just change the code over and over. And so we kind of took the stance of like, that is systems monitoring. And that's an important industry. But that industry has plateaued because at the end of the day, there are more and more people writing the business logic, less and less net new people writing sort of the platform layer. People, I don't monitor disk failures.
Right.
GCP monitors disk.
Exactly.
I no longer have those problems, right? And so our sort of belief is that wave continues and we continue to sort of abstract these low-level problems. But if that's true, then there needs to be technology that helps you actually monitor more of the business logic, the application code, and focus on those problems, third-party vendors that you're using those problems rather than underlying hardware problems or something like that. And so that's kind of been our approach. And that's why our error monitoring is so coupled to like the stack trace has to be really enriched. It has to be service oriented. We don't care about CPU and memory. They're just not good tools in this kind of problem space. And that's almost how we think about the differentiation of things.
And so would it be accurate to say that Sentry is much more closely coupled to the product engineer, whereas, an infrastructure monitoring tool more generically would be for, as you were saying, the platform team, or maybe even there's a stronger thesis there of that's going to just be less and less required as AWS or GCP build higher order abstractions where, you don't have to have like infrastructure instance monitoring if you're using Lambda, right? Because that's kind of just been abstracted away from you.
Yeah, and that's the fundamental belief. Whether you agree or not with serverless, the concept of outsourcing the platform has always, like Heroku started the big wave here, in my opinion. Maybe not Heroku started it, but they were the big name at the time. We still want the same thing. Like, I don't want to run any of this stuff. I spent the last 2 days fighting with GCP for my side project, just like make it not cost a couple $100 a month, All I want to do is deploy some application images, have a database that exists, have it all securely managed for me, and that's it, right? And that should get cheaper and more efficient over time. I don't think cloud vendors are doing that, of course, but you see all the past investment these days, like Vercel, Render, Fly, like Railway. There's so many of them. And so the demand is still there. And we bet on that demand. We bet that exactly what we want is the truth. Nobody wants to run that shit.
Yeah. Why do you think it is, and maybe this is a tangent from Sentry specifically, but why do you think it is that the experience of deploying code doesn't feel like it's gotten simpler? Or maybe you disagree, but there is clearly demand for things to be simple. Obviously, Sentry has a very simple instrumentation experience in large part across lots of different environments, but you're still having to deal with deploying containers, and you're still having to deal with observability issues, and it doesn't feel like we've made that much headway.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, there's like two sides of this, right? Big tech has gotten more complicated. And so Sentry needs something like GCP to fully outsource the systems layer, but we're building our own platform on top.
Yeah.
Right? That's fine. And to do that and to deal with customers like Sentry, you do actually need at least some degree of complexity in it, or available complexity, I guess. Well, the reality is that's where the money is, right? It's servicing customers like Sentry, not servicing my side project, at least for cloud vendors. And so I just don't think they're incentivized, and or they're just not good at simplicity, because they've tried, of course. Like you've seen, at least I'm not familiar as much with AWS, but like you had App Engine and all this stuff from Google that tried.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like one challenge of it. I think there is a truth that technology has gotten more complex for two reasons. I think one, we're trying to do things that we didn't do before. And so I think that's richer, sort of more native feeling responsive applications. And that there's inherent complexity to do that kind of thing, versus I've got a web server and it just returns HTML. And so, okay, a little bit of complexity there. I think there's also just a lot of complexity in the scale of the internet, and all this stuff it's different, that actually doesn't impact most people, which is odd because the complexity is still there no matter what. But I think if I just had to put my finger on it, in my opinion, it's like everything's more complex because some things are more complex, which is not a good outcome, to be fair, but it is, it is difficult these days.
Do you think it's possible that part of it is, and I think you were getting at this, Sentry has, let's say 90,000 customers, whereas most of these infrastructure providers or infrastructure tools, I'm guessing a lot of them start with some very big customers who have very complex requirements, because that's where the money is to begin. And so you end up with a roadmap that's largely driven by that complexity rather than a very opinionated kind of product forward, almost consumer looking product, because I imagine Sentry is not really beholden to one big customer that's driving a checkbox set of features, right?
Yeah, and that's very much true. Like, and I actually hate when we have a few like significant customers. I'm not happy about that, generally speaking, because it's fine that we have them, but I will not allow anybody to like cater to them, in the sense of like, what we do has to operate on the many, and that's a very difficult problem. But I think, one, it's a lot easier to build something when you ask somebody what they want and you just give them that result, right? And that's what most successful companies do. It's very hard to build something when you're kind of going after like a long tail market share kind of play, where ACVs have to be lower, like more consumer apps, right? And I think it's harder because you often don't have the patience, or you don't have the financial capability to be patient, And I always tell people, because like one of I think the greatest strengths we had when we started everything, and still today, is like, we're going to do something that we believe in, and we're going to do it whatever way we think is the most interesting or relevant to us. We're not going to do whatever way seems easiest or status quo or anything like this. And so it was always like, we want to do market share. We want to have, like, as part of that, like the low price point, we want to have it like self-hosted for free and open source with a big asterisk on it and things like that. And those are not the straightforward decisions of building a successful business. Those are like, why would you choose all these like weird branches to make things more difficult along the way?
Yeah.
And I don't think people often, one, are willing to take those sort of, call it risks, if you will. I don't see it that way. And two, I just don't think people have a strong enough opinion about what the problem is they're solving in many cases.
Yeah. Why do you think, or maybe what gave you the patience 10, 15 years ago to say, we're not going to, go and try to get a few $1 million deals and build our roadmap on them? Like, is it that you just think you had a very clear idea of what error monitoring or just business logic monitoring, let's call it, should look like? Or is it just like, you weren't interested in it for the monetization business aspect, and, genuinely is a side project that you wanted to productionize and give to other developers?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because by the time we were venture funded, we had a couple thousand paid accounts making money. Not a lot. Our ACV must have been like $300 or something terrible, right?
Yeah.
And there's a real challenge. You cannot do enterprise sales and do bottoms up at the same time. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah.
You often see enterprise companies try to like now switch and add bottoms up, and they all fail at it. Like nobody's ever pulled it off as far as I understand. And it's because you've got all these $1 million plus deals over here. How are you going to justify optimizing for these, $30 a month, $100 a month things, right? And this is the same problem you see with cloud providers often, right? And you've got to have like top down strategic belief in the model, right? It's not you can't just react financially. Otherwise it's not going to work. And so we were always like, there was no way for us to sell a 7-figure deal once upon a time. It just didn't exist, right? It's like, we can't charge enough money for errors. And so we knew we needed more products to raise ACV over a long period of time. And these days, it's still hard for us to charge 7 figures just for error monitoring. It's doable, but it's still very, very rare and difficult. And that's fine. We just accept that that's not the business we're in for the most part. And then we just focus on what the business is, And I think it's fine, but it's a very different thing. I think it's just, you got to decide. One's probably easier than the other. I think 7 figures is still hard, to be fair, but like 10, 20, 30, 40K deals early on. Like here's a good analogy. We had Delta Airlines was an early self-serve customer. I don't know exactly what or how. I just know they had an account. They're spending $29 a month. They would not expand ever. They didn't have the usage to expand. It was probably some internal R&D team doing who knows what, right? That's okay. It's not fun when you're in sales and you see that, because you're like, oh, that's an enterprise logo. I should be able to commercialize that. And the fact is you just can't, because adoption creates commercialization. And unless they're willing to and have a need to adopt it somewhere else where there is just that usage of it that is like consumer scale, we're just not going to monetize it well. And that's a hard thing to come to grips with, because you can't manipulate growth then from a traditional field sales model. It's got to be much more true product led.
And I mean, the other thing that is kind of complicating things, obviously, is Sentry has this open source model, which I think has been a mixed bag for the industry at large. But how has that played into this commercialization conversation? And how do you think about, big companies who maybe have a pretty big use case just going and saying, we're going to use the open source software?
Yeah, I think the way I always talk about this is Sentry is open source, or was open source. We're pretty close to it, but just quick aside, Sentry has 2 models. A lot of our stuff's open source, true open source, free. And our core repo is open source after 2 years, but it's a license that allows you to non-commercially utilize it effectively. So you can just run it yourself, no strings attached, same code we run in prod. And so we used to be full open source. And that, again, this is only because we want to do business this way. We think it's a better path forward from an industry as a whole. And people would often ask, like, well, how do you monetize open source, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to ignore all of that, because the answer is it's not related. Open source is effectively a distribution model. And so you got to think of that open source as marketing. And the way we always got value of open source is we would help these customers. They would contribute back once in a while, but not a lot. At the end of the day, it was mostly us building the software.
Right.
But the best story I have from early on is Uber was a really big user of Sentry. They had the biggest installation, bigger than our SaaS service. They had an installation inside of Uber. They're self-hosting all this stuff. And when we venture funded, we're like, oh, this is going to be easy. We're just going to convert Uber and Airbnb and all these people that were just like running like free open source, right? Spoiler, we didn't convert any of them. But Uber is a good one, because we actually did charge Uber at some point significant amount of money for the scale we were at. It was a 6-figure deal, but it was for like customer support and what might as well be, consulting or professional services.
Right.
And very quickly, we're like, this sucks. We don't want to do this. It's a distraction. And we did not renew the contract. And we just kind of like said, well, I don't think we can convert Uber. And a couple of years later, we realized it didn't matter, because what we saw was all these companies like Uber, eventually they came to the SaaS service, but they didn't come from Uber in the sense of Uber never signed up. But all those employees, or a lot of employees, would move on to other, roles at different companies. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I used Sentry at Uber. It was great. Also, there's a SaaS service. It cost us like $30 to set up. And that was phenomenal for us. And so that's where I go back to, it's a distribution model. It's marketing at the end of the day. There's obviously other benefits of open source, but I think from a business point of view, that's such a big deal. And I think it's very hard to believe that anybody is ever going to win again in the sort of IT infrastructure space against an open source player that builds AAA product. And I wholeheartedly have that belief at this point. It may not be universally true yet. And again, it still matters. It's got to be like tomatoes to tomatoes kind of thing comparison. It can't be like, here's a mediocre bad product that's open source compared to like a phenomenal product that's proprietary. But same playing level, like open source is going to win because it just provides all these great benefits and beliefs. And it's almost like it's a culture you're buying into, right?
Yeah.
And I think people underappreciate that idea of open source. And that comes closely, like the last like sort of fork in that I want to go into is open source is effectively for us, the way we think about it is brand marketing. It's not just marketing or distribution. And what I mean by that is I loved it, especially internally at Sentry these days. I talk a lot about brand marketing, brand awareness. And one of the examples I give is Liquid Death, which if you're not familiar, it's a cool looking can of water. It's still water in a can. It's not a new idea, but they're not selling water. What they're selling is not beer. It's just a beer alternative that's just water that looks cool, looks like you're drinking beer. You go to clubs, they sell you Liquid Death now. I was at a music concert, all they sold was Liquid Death, but they're selling not water, right? And that's it. And it's like Sentry is not selling error monitoring. We're selling a philosophy in how we think about open source sustainability, or we're selling a philosophy in how we think about privacy or product quality, all these other things. And I think that is not normal in tech for sure, but you see it a lot in consumer markets and things like that. And so that's the other part I think of open source that really matters for us, is it is a brand that we are really focused on.
Yeah, and I think to this point of it being a distribution strategy or brand marketing, it does feel like it's not the sort of thing that you can, act on later in the company lifecycle. It really does feel like it has to be in the DNA of the company. Do you think that's true? Like, do you think it presumably would have been very hard for you to espouse this philosophy years after Sentry started? And maybe a related question, like, do you think this is why there aren't more open source successful large scale products? Just the founder DNA or the product DNA isn't there from the beginning?
Yeah. So I think almost everything in a company has to be top down, in the sense of it has to be believed in at the top and enforced from the top. It might not come from the top. But for example, if it's like a bunch of engineers like open source and everybody in the executive team is like, whatever, we don't really understand or care about it, it's not going to survive as a bit, as a core thing. So that matters. I think the reason it's less common is because it's very hard, and it does have to be in your DNA. And there's a bunch of these like attributes, right? Like Sentry is not successful because we're open source. Sentry might be more successful because we were open source, but it's not successful because of that. And I think this is where the confusion comes in a lot. And so I think there's that aspect, but then there's a lot of this like fear and challenging of like, well, what's the value of open source? And we are open source just because like my entire career, I've just shipped open source software. I just didn't care, right? It seems fine, no problems here. But I do talk to a lot of people that like kind of go into open source and they maybe don't have a strong belief around why or what it is. They think it's probably useful to do, which is fine. That's not a bad thing. But I think especially trying to go that direction after the fact, you can. Don't get me wrong, you totally can. Because Sentry, for example, we have a bunch of this privacy stuff going on that we're going to talk about. We were not that early days. We're like, no, just give us all your data and trust us. We'll protect it. It's more useful if we have this data. Now we're like, we're actually going to give you a ton of controls and be like aggro pro privacy because we think like this is important now and it's changing. So I think you can change first off. I think you've got to be thoughtful about what it is and what your risks are and when it does or doesn't matter, right? And so Sentry was open source until one company decided they wanted to resell Sentry, one company that had never contributed to Sentry at all. And I'm like, this is annoying. We're like, why would we tolerate this kind of thing? And we were the IP holders, so it didn't matter. Now, we could have been open source and that could have been fine. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we chose to switch to this other licensing strategy where it's like, well, now we're protected. We can still monetize Sentry. But I think there's this interesting aspect where there's not been a company that's gotten so big and stayed true free open source and monetized extraordinarily well. Like there's no billion-dollar revenue companies that are like exclusively open source, free open source software. And I think the free part is important because what I mean by free is not free software foundation. I mean free as in almost no strings attached in the sense of like not GPL. I mean free as in permissive free because GPL effectively has constraints that are attached to it. And one way some of these companies monetize is by scaring other companies from using their open source by putting these licenses that are really like high risk for certain organizations, right? And so I want to believe somebody will do it at some point. They'll take that leap and it will work. We were not going to be the ones that quite do it because it was just frustrating for us. But I think it's doable. I don't think it's a limitation anymore.
And I guess maybe last point on this open source topic, what do you think folks have to take away from things like Kafka or tools where cloud providers go and effectively take the software and resell it in a way that, presumably takes a decent chunk out of the business of the company that created the software?
Yeah. So one thing I was talking to a couple friends the other day who are considering open sourcing their core service. And they're like, well, what kind of license do we use? Do we use the new Sentry released recently? Do we use business source license, open core? Blah. There's all these decisions, right? And I told them, I'm like, the decision has to be inherently connected to how you're going to monetize, because open source is part of the packaging model. It's part of the distribution model. It's the same way, like, which features you get for $20 are part of your packaging model. That's how you monetize everything. And so if it doesn't make sense, if it's not attached to that, it's not going to be successful. And so, think about Kafka. If the only way to monetize Kafka is through cloud hosting, and the whole goal of Kafka is to make it really easy to run, well, I mean, newsflash, anybody that can sell it is going to win. Like whoever sells it best wins, because there's nothing there. Like the packaging is just, let's make it dumb easy to run.
Yeah.
But if the whole thing with Kafka is, say, like, you need all these tools on top or something else, right? Okay, maybe it's fine all of a sudden. And it doesn't mean you'll have exclusive rights or anything. And that might be okay. And I think there's this interesting thing that we've not seen enough data, and you got to take some risks to see, of like, well, take Sentry, for example, just because you can't really compete with us. If it was truly free open source, super easy to run and commercialize, so there could be Sentry alternatives in SaaS, would that harm our business, or would it broaden the market for our business? It's really hard to say, because like you have MongoDB and Elastic who have these same kind of things with like AWS and whatnot, and they're still very successful companies. And so it's really hard to say that it hurt them at all. And to be fair, they've also always had proprietary components that they sort of shipped alongside things. Maybe in their case, those things were just not good enough. They had one product, which was the infrastructure component, that had great product market fit. And then they had a bunch of products that never achieved product market fit. And that's why they couldn't monetize as well as they wanted, or something along those lines,
Yeah. And it also feels like this weird tension of you open source your core technology, and then you kind of actively work against that by trying to create closed source adjacencies that only you offer, that someone else doesn't offer. It feels like it feels that tension with the original spirit of having open source the thing in the first place, right?
Yeah, I agree. One point I want to make on that is I think this is one of the most challenging pieces, and it's why Sentry is we have so high conviction around our model of like, protect ourselves to sell the SaaS service, to commercialize everything, because we do not want to cripple the software to distribute it, right? And we're not a great case study. We're not infrastructure. We're just a product that we sell that's complicated to run. But it is like that business model. I think a lot of people would desire to just be like, I just want to commercialize it via cloud services, but so do some of the biggest companies in the world. And so that's sort of like where we're at with the tug of war,
Yeah. I want to get back a little bit to the technical side of things. So Sentry obviously has to be reliable, has to ingest the data, and it also has to be really easy to set up with as little configurability as possible across a ton of different environments. How do you manage that product surface area? Like, I'm assuming, internally you can't possibly use every Sentry SDK, you can't test every framework. But on the other hand, with that many companies and developers using Sentry, you're going to get bug reports across every framework, and things that can go wrong will go wrong. That seems like a pretty challenging technical problem at scale. So, or maybe it's also an organizational staffing problem. How do you think about that?
I stole this from somebody else the other day. It's open source with a healthy dose of capitalism. And what I mean by that is Sentry, as long as it's had money, has paid contractors to help us maintain our SDKs. And because it is a staffing problem, it's just a sheer breadth of problems to solve and expertise. And those people we often pay, we're just contributors. We're like, hey, this is great. You want to keep contributing and just have money also? Which I would encourage more people to do. It's a phenomenal model if it works, but it is a really hard challenge. And I'll tell you, it gets harder and harder because once upon a time, it's like, well, Django and Rails and Laravel, and they're big targets that are like, a lot of people use one thing, you solve it once, you tweak it a little bit every so often, maintain it, and you're fine. That's become more and more problematic in recent years as the change in user interfaces with basically with the JavaScript movement. You have some of this on mobile too, where there's a lot of change in how we develop mobile apps, and everybody wants like a new language or a new framework all the time.
Right.
And that shouldn't be such a problem. But the problem is most of these frameworks, well, one, sometimes they're built by people who have not really run like production operations in software. And so they're not always designed with, we need telemetry in mind, So that's one challenge. I think the other challenge is, even when they are run by these people, they're so complicated sometimes and again, the same problem, they've not really thought about, hey, like people actually need to be able to diagnose all these problems in production. And that list gets endless, And you
Right.
see that a lot with the JavaScript frameworks these days, where they've gotten so complicated to debug. And the frameworks themselves, because there's so many moving parts, and it's not like they often don't control the whole thing, it's very hard for them to even simplify that. And so in an ideal world, new framework comes out, it's built in some core hooks,
Yeah.
and we shim those hooks, right? And then for us, it should primarily be, do we support that language really
Hmm.
well? And then do we support the framework via some hooks? But what I'll tell you in practice, it is, we spend lots and lots of engineering hours supporting every framework under the sun. And
Yeah.
it's a never ending moving target that is very, very hard to do. I don't know what our total staffing is behind it, but I do think if you include, we have SDKs, right? Which again, we either contract or full-time engineering staff pretty much any SDK that's run. And it's usually
Hmm.
more than one headcount per.
Hmm.
Mobile, for example, I think we have 9 people on, which is insane
Wow.
to me. But so that's one. And I think the other side you have to understand is it's not just like an SDK. There's all these like language sort of runtime specific challenges. So
Right.
you think about, like, for me, SDK is like it's Next.js or it's Django. Well,
Yeah.
you've got AWS Lambda serverless shenanigans, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got
Yeah.
everybody else's flavor of serverless, and they all work differently, and they're all their own frameworks on top of everybody else's frameworks. And it's like, I don't know. I think this problem is unsolvable in its current shape, and I don't know what we're going to do about it, in all honesty. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of people want to believe like open telemetry and stuff's the solution. I will tell you it's just not, because
Yeah.
it's just not. It doesn't solve it well enough in so many scenarios, especially in the front end where the problem is the biggest. And open telemetry is like, ignore the logs and the metrics, but the tracing component, that's good. But it's only one little component of everything we need to do. And like Sentry's not going to like create some open errors spec, let alone
Yeah.
cater to open telemetry trying to do it, because one, it's big company process shenanigans. Two, we are so invested in our entire, thing. We're not going to spend tens of millions of dollars just to make it easy for more copycats to show up, And so there's all
Yeah.
these challenges, and I just don't know what the solution is going to be. But I will tell you forever, it's always just like, we have to invest in it. We have to be really good at it. And
Yeah.
when we're not, we have to recognize it and double down on that investment.
But that is interesting, because it sounds like, yeah, one shape of solution to that problem, which may or may not work, is try to get an RFC out there, try to make these frameworks move in some direction rather than you having to staff every incremental framework that comes out. And it sounds like you're saying that's probably not the right solution, because it, yeah, in some sense lowers the barriers to entry to the market, but also maybe it's just unrealistic for that to actually happen.
Yeah. I think it's unrealistic, because what often happens with standard bodies is they develop a standard and it's fast right away because there's no adoption. And then there's adoption and it stops. And even when there's adoption, it's not universal adoption. There's still
Yeah.
people that are like, I don't like this. I'm going to do it my way. And so
Yeah.
even though I think open telemetry for the tracing specific stuff, so open tracing back in the day, there's a lot of great ideas in there, because we should not have to instrument a bunch of third-party libraries over and over and over and over. The adoption, this is like a many years old project at this point, and it's still got such minuscule adoption in the industry that I'm like, if that's the outcome, it's like, we're definitely not wasting time on trying to create a standard, And so
Yeah.
I don't know what the solution is, but one interesting analogy to that problem is, recently we released something called Spotlight at Sentry, which is actually unrelated to Sentry, but all we did was we basically took our SDKs and we leveraged the data collection to build like a debug bar locally,
Mhm.
like a better
Mhm.
debugger in development environments. And we did have to change the SDKs. Fortunately, we control them, so it's easy.
Yeah.
But we were actually able to take something we had already built and leverage it into something that's entirely different, that just needed similar kinds of data,
Yeah.
So there's this interesting concept in there, even though it's not like an open standard, and we're certainly not going to change our SDKs to help a competitor. We were actually able to expand the market capabilities using what is our internal standard, And so I don't know, maybe we'll just keep funding all this until the end of time, and the number of engineers on SDKs will be like 500 in 5 years. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I like to believe it's becoming more of a mature industry. And I think there's these curves where it kind of expands in terms of like complexity and ideas, and then it contracts like as things start to mature. We haven't seen it contract yet, unfortunately, in like the JavaScript world especially.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd like to believe we're getting more mature about the technology these days. And there's a lot more people with a lot more depth of experience building some of those projects versus, I just live in the PHP ecosystem and all I do is build PHP, so I don't know what happens over here. We've got a lot more breadth in the industry now.
Yeah. Maybe talking about a, I guess, relatively significantly more immature problem, I've noticed that you all have also started to build some AI features into Sentry, but in a very like Sentry-like way, where in some sense, it's very transparent that these things are guesses, that you're not trying to pin down the problem, but you're trying to directionally suggest what might be the issue. We can talk about the future, but what I'm wondering about is more philosophically, do you think that's here to stay? Do you think that right now it's kind of a toe dip into AI just to see if it lands with developers and you're really going to solidly focus headcount and technical investment into actual proven problems with maybe an opinionated stance rather than let's just do AI because AI is the thing?
Yeah. I think a lot of people are doing AI because AI is the thing. And I will tell you,
Yeah.
I personally have very little confidence. A lot of the spaces make sense for it. I think there are some interesting things that the language models can work on today. And I'm not an expert by any means, but I've been playing with them. Then there are things they are just absolutely horrendous at. And I'm not a believer of like, oh, shiny new technology, let's force its way into something.
Yeah.
You know? And that feels like what's happening in a lot of ways versus like, oh, obviously this is powerful here. And I think it's fair that they don't know and they're testing it. But every company in the world is like, look at our AI chatbot thing. I'm like, I don't need
Exactly.
an AI chatbot, you know? And so ours is kind of like, we actually just spun up a dedicated ML AI investment, but it's not a dedicated LLM chat GPT investment.
Mhm.
We are interested to see what makes sense there, but we're thoughtful about it from a point of view where we're realistic. And we are not just going to build something that anybody else can build.
Yep.
Frankly, a smaller company is going to be better at building something quickly than us. So it's like, well, what could we uniquely do that others can't? And that's like, well, what can we uniquely do with the amount of interesting telemetry we have and things like that? And so a lot of the near-term investment for us is kind of like, well, it's not so much that the LLM tech is interesting. It's that we should run more experiments. We are at a scale where the money is irrelevant to us to staff like a small team, you know?
Yeah.
And if something ends up being very valuable, well, that the ROI is really, really large. And so I think we'll see, as an example, CodeCub, which is a company we acquired a while back, who kind of does, I like to think of it as like Sentry pre-production. And so can we stop bugs from happening, even though it's mostly focused on test coverage right now? But they actually have, it's like not documented or announced, but there's something we built internally that is not good at all yet. Maybe it will, but it's just a code review buddy. And I'm like, can somebody just do this and have it evaluate the code and tell me what's broken? Because again, the language models are not perfect, but I have seen in my own code where I've given it a complex function and it has identified something that I could not identify myself. And if it can do that, can it make code review more efficient or something? Now, that's not a uniquely us problem, of course, but I'm like, there are areas where it does seem interesting, I guess. But I think a lot of the technology, the language models are either too expensive or they're just not capable enough yet to really pull something off that's great.
But it sounds like basically they've reduced the barrier to entry enough where a company like Sentry, it makes sense to run more experiments involving them, even if it doesn't mean releasing full-fledged features that use them just yet.
Yeah. Though I will say the complexity for Sentry is we're not going to funnel data to OpenAI, and so we have to run models behind our firewall and like GCP. We just have this intense policy around data processors, and so we do have like an OpenAI feature, but it's opt-in for this one single feature, meaning we couldn't all of a sudden make like a network-wide. So we're figuring out some of that, but the technology I think is exciting. But just like every new piece of technology, it's a little bit overhyped, I think. And it's like, you saw this with Bitcoin and shit. Even though that was more like, how do we launder money? It was like, oh, can we apply a distributed hash blockchain to every problem in the world? Where most of the time it makes no sense.
Yeah. Awesome. So maybe last question I'll ask is less on the technical side, but I'm curious about this. Sentry's brand is very unique. And as you were saying, a lot of these things I imagine do come top down, but you all have billboards around Sentry can't fix this with this like phone falling on you. The text on the marketing site in the product is really silly. What's driving that? Is that just like, again, your ethos and like kind of leadership ethos? Or do you think it's something to do with, people who use Sentry are presumably stressed at times, right? And is there something around the actual product surface?
This is just a strong belief in brand marketing. So part of our brand is be authentic, and it's okay to be tongue in cheek. There's a balance there, of course. It's not, our brand is not talk shit. My brand is talk shit, to be clear, but our company brand is not. It's just like, let's tell it how it is. So my favorite analogy here, or my favorite example of this rather, is in Sentry's core, we have a single page applications. It's very large these days. And when we built it, which it must be 2015, React Spa, we put it in a loading indicator we thought was funny. It looks cool. And it's just like, please wait while we load an obnoxious amount of JavaScript. Back in the day, you never saw it. Now you see it all the time, and it's very true. It actually wasn't that true back in the day. It still kind of felt like, And that's phenomenal. Like people love it. It's like tongue in cheek. It's just us like sort of like demeaning ourselves, but we actually have brand voice policies internally that are all centered around this. And so I think it did come from the early team, but I think great ideas are not just coming from a person or a set of people. They are things that people value and then latch onto. And so that one's like held pretty well for us. And so like, I'm partially responsible for the billboard campaign and my voice is very strong, but other people took it and ran with it and then made it better or something because the idea was like, Sentry can't fix this. First off, Sentry doesn't fix anything.
Yeah.
And secondly, the things it would depict have nothing to do with anything Sentry does. So like the first one or the main one was, it was a minotaur, like the magical creature, playing Beat Saber and knocking over some pots. And it's like, what even is that?
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. It's like a billboard. It's like, you're looking at it and you're like, what is that? And I'm like, what the hell is Sentry? And that's kind of the thesis behind it. But a lot of it just like, there's a lot of stiff corporate marketing. There's no reason to do it. Again, it's just a belief we have,
Awesome. Well, here's to more billboards in the coming year. And thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me. This was fun.
Awesome.